Right, hello. So this is Dr. Tom Staffen again. Hello, it's my weekly broadcast here from the centre of France, the old heartland of Druid Gaul, in the middle between Limousin and, it's a beautiful part of the world. And I'm also in the province near to Centre, which goes up to the Loire Valley. And yeah, it's a magic part of the world. So greetings to everyone from here, and I'm running the European Peace Museum here, as some of you know, and continuing with my Institute of Peace Studies that I set up at the University of London in 1991. And this week, to celebrate these European elections that have just happened, we still don't know the results. I'll talk about that a bit. I'm going to be talking mainly from an academic perspective about peace and conflict studies. I'm going to be talking about Brexit and the Middle East and other things. And I want to start, really, it's in 4 sections, this talk, by just kind of introducing myself again, because people may listen to these talks and not really know where I'm coming from and not understand why I'm doing them, what's the point. As you know, I'm doing a weekly fast on Sundays. As a Druid and as a peace activist, a Gandhian, inspired by the whole non-violence movement, my opposition to Brexit is mainly premised on my years and years of study into peace. I've had an unusual career, and not many people know the whole story. It would take too long to explain it all. But what I want to do is just summarise it now and give you some indication why I'm doing this and why I'm so opposed to Brexit. Because I do have dear friends in England who say, Thomas, what is this obsession with Brexit? What's wrong with Brexit? We voted for it. Just let it go. I want to explain to them and to everyone else that no, this is actually quite important. But before I can do that, I have to explain where I'm coming from and why I've reached the conclusions I've come to. Because I think it's been quite unusual as a career and as a life. And I'm therefore sharing the fruit of many, many, many years of study and reflection and activism. I began my life studying philosophy at university. I became interested in comparative spirituality, Buddhism, very early on, 19, etc. And I started a lifetime quest into the search for ultimate truth. It was the 70s. One thought one had all the time in the world. So I went off to Canada and studied independently at the University of Calgary and read through every single philosophical text, all the great world religions. It's when I read the Bible fully, cover to cover, for the first time, taught myself ancient Greek to read it in the original, some Hebrew, discovered the Kabbalah, discovered the amazing depths of that tradition, and discovered the Quran. I read the Quran cover to cover in detail with notes and maps and encyclopedias, and discovered the richness of Islam. And then I studied the different forms of Islam: Sufism, Sunnism, Shiism. I'd already met some living Sufis in Brighton, so I was already aware of the depth of Sufism. But now I was studying the Quran in depth, and it totally blew me away. My problem was I wanted to join everything. They were all so amazing. I wanted to be a Sufi and a Buddhist and a Christian. I went to Quaker meetings. I became a Quaker. I ran the Quaker Bible study class at the University of Calgary for several years. I got deeply into biblical studies. And I just fell in love with them all. And I thought, why on earth is this planet so full of violence? If these wisdom traditions have been saying there's a divine unity behind everything, what's going on? Why is nobody listening? So I then said, well, okay, so we have to raise the flag of peace somehow. So I came back to London in the early 80s and set up Philosophers and Historians for Peace as an activist stroke research group with a dear friend of mine, John Francis Phipps, who was a mystic, a Catholic, a scientist, a philosopher, from a very interesting family. His father had been the British ambassador in Germany during the 1930s and to France, And that family, which is still going, used to own Buckingham Palace, the grounds on which Buckingham Palace are built. They were a Roman Catholic family, and eventually ended up in the Vale of Pewsey, but fascinating people. And John Francis was a dear friend of mine. We set this thing up together, Philosophers and Historians for Peace. We had meetings in London, which was the beginning of a nucleus of peace researchers. And I discovered this thing called peace research, which most people, never hear of. Because I was going to Quaker meetings, as well as every other kind of form of spirituality that's going, I would go to Buddhist meetings, and I joined every single kind of learned society interested in philosophical study and so on. And I took my job as coordinator of Philosophers for Peace very, very seriously. I mean, it's a huge job. My strategy was, okay, so we've got all these philosophies in the world. Their followers are all fighting each other. This was the time just after the invasion of Afghanistan in '79 by the Russians. There was chaos in Afghanistan. There was chaos in Iran because after the return of Khomeini, there'd been the revolution, and some people really liked that, some people didn't. There was the hostages chaos with the American embassy being seized, and it looked like the world was teetering on the brink of a war in the Middle East over all this. And so I'd gone on to this deep inner journey of reflection and study, and like Utnapishtim, sent to the bottom to find when he sent Gilgamesh down to get the Tree of Immortality. This time I actually found it. And I didn't let the dragon steal it from me. I got it back. If you don't know what I'm talking about, read the Epic of Gilgamesh and his encounter with Utnapishtim. It's the oldest story in the world. It's Sumerian, the oldest story in the world, long before the Bible or any of these other texts, which I also studied. Of course, I studied the ancient pagan traditions, and I did a course in anthropology at the University of Calgary looking at prehistory and paleohistory and, who we are, where Homo sapiens come from. Anyway, so then I, back in London, I continued to study. I got very involved with the Kabbalistic traditions. I studied in depth, went to various Kabbalistic teachers and learned, used the amazing resources in London. I was still studying Sufism and practicing in my own way, and I used to go to the mosque in Regent's Park and got to know the people there very well. I was going to Jungian, the Analytical Psychology Club in London, in Notting Hill Gate, with learned lectures from people that knew Jung, and I resonated with Jung's search for truth, ultimately. I mean, I'm a sort of Jungian or post-Jungian, like Hillman, because I believe that Jung pioneered some incredible research into what he called the collective unconscious, which is the mechanism whereby the God experience happens to all these individual sages of the past. And then, anyway, cut a long story short, I then ended up doing a degree at the University of London, because although I'd been studying in depth all this stuff, I didn't have, I wanted to ground it within the academic community. So I studied modern history at the University of London and history of ideas, political philosophy. And I was a very over-the-top enthusiastic student. I went to extra lectures, I did loads of extra essays. I did a whole paper that I needn't have done. I did more work than any other student that year at the University of London. And I felt I'd gone to heaven, because here I had all these amazing libraries, the LSE, King's College, where I did a paper on Balkan history. Got very interested in the Balkans, and I was doing European history since early times, and European political philosophy, Plato and Aristotle and Machiavelli and Hobbes and Locke and Marx and Engels and Hegel, the whole tradition of political philosophy. Now, why was I doing all this? Well, because I was trying to help build peace, right? Because with all these warring factions, political factions, religious factions, running armies around the world with massive weaponry at their behest, we're living on borrowed time here as a planet, because I'd studied the Cold War. I was doing a paper diplomatic history of the Cold War at the London School of Economics at the time, which grew into my PhD topic. And, there are so many nuclear weapons that are primed to go at any one time on this planet that they could go off by accident. And I have books next door that they have nearly gone off by accident several times. There's a story of Yeltsin was brought the codes and told by his Russian commanders the Americans had just attacked us. And he told them to go away. He was drunk at the time and he refused to press the button. It would have been World War III. Thank God he was drunk, with people like Trump in power and phone calls coming in from, hawks like Netanyahu, we're not living in a safe world. And when he's threatening Iran all the time, this kind of thing. So that's my work, is to prevent, really, World War III. Now, I have had dear friends, Jehovah's Witnesses and other kind of apocalyptic Christians come to me and say, Thomas, stop trying to save the world. God is going to judge the world. Armageddon is it's impossible to prevent. It's happening very soon within our lifetimes. And what I say to them, well, is that a deliberate choice of God? Does God want Armageddon where, 9/10 of the world's population are slaughtered in a nuclear war? And they say, yes, that's God's choice, because people are so evil. Well, what I say to them is yeah, okay, but that's not my God. I don't follow a God of destruction and, violence. That's a megalomaniac, revenge God. That's more like a devil figure, actually. My God is a God of peace and justice and truth and love, and I still believe it's possible to redeem and save this planet. My only possible, way of doing that is through education. That's why I became a teacher. And I said, look, you guys can go and, do your prayers, and if you think Armageddon's coming, fine. I'm not in that team. I'm trying to prevent Armageddon through education. Because, the thought of Armageddon, the thought of a nuclear war destroying this planet is just a nightmare. I really can't even, I can't get my head around anybody that would think that would be God's wish for mankind. But I know there are people in all the, certainly in all the kind of monotheistic faiths of Christianity, Islam and Judaism, who actually think that is God's plan for humanity. And actually, there's nothing we can do to stop it. I think some of the people around Trump, some of the extreme right Christian Zionists, right-wing Christian Zionists, and some of the extreme Zionists in Israel believe that philosophy. They believe that, their God is going to win, and the way he's going to show that he's won is by destroying every other people. So I don't know, is that what America wants? That, that every other part of the world is a nuclear wasteland apart from Israel and the US? I mean, you listen to some American hardliners and that's kind of what they think. I find that distasteful and ignorant and immoral. And there are so many problems in the world that could be sorted that we need to denuclearize the planet. My strategy is denuclearize the planet, get rid of all these nuclear weapons, as we hoped we were going to do in 1990 when we signed the Treaty of Paris. We thought the Cold War was over and that we could divert the resources from nuclear weapons and the arms race to social expenditure. Well, that's what it still has to be done. So how can we get that? Well, it has to be done through some kind of interfaith peace treaty. We have to get these religions to shake hands and say to each other, we're going to postpone Armageddon. None of us is going to win here. Let's win together. Let's have a collective educational transformation, which is the real meaning of apocalypse. Apocalypse means unveiling, right? Revelation. So the true rewind, I've stood on the hill of Megiddo. Armageddon was a very long time ago. It was a very nasty battle. But the true genre of wisdom that we need to be working on is called apocalypse, which means unveiling. So we need a kind of educational apocalypse that unveils the wisdom traditions of the past, going right back into the deep past of humanity, find out who we are, where we came from, and find out our best sides. That means each one of us has work to do. This is what Muhammad called the greater jihad, the great struggle, is to find our own enlightenment. It's what Mahavira said. to become a victor, you have to become a Jain, you have to achieve conquest over your negativity, your false desires, your despair, your negative thought patterns, all the same thing. And Buddha said the same. And Christ, that's what he was king of. He was king of this kingdom of heaven, which is a process of self-mastery. It's not an outer kingdom. That's where Charlemagne and Constantine got it wrong. It's not Christendom that we're going to have empire. No, it's a state of being that reaches out towards truth, and that finds what in Christianity is called gnosis, which is the inner light. So anyway, that's and so we're talking about 40 years of detailed study into all that on a comparative spiritual basis, both experientially and theoretically. And then I then continued at the University of London. After I graduated, I was asked by a committee to set up an Institute of Peace Studies at the university, because scholars had come together since the end of World War II, 1950s, this new field of peace research had been launched, because other people, not just me, but a whole load of other people, said the world is in crisis. We have nuclear weapons. How can we prevent this? What can we do as scholars? And so they developed this field called peace research, or peace and conflict research, because some of them chose to study peace, some chose to study conflict resolution, some created a system of thought called conflict analysis. But it's an interlocking, complex field. Others looked at international organisation, international law, and then every discipline, every branch of academia got involved in this. So I spent then about 5 years based at the University of London, had an office in Bloomsbury, in Gordon Square, attached to the Institute of Education, and I made it my life's work then to look at every single attempt to think through peace, working with professors around the world. Now this is before the internet, it was just at the beginnings of the internet, so I wrote to them physically with envelopes to all the most learned academics I could find in peace research, and I said, look, what's the secret of peace? Please, if we set up a centre here at the University of London, what would you advise its curriculum to be? How would we approach it? And what, from your field of expertise, would you say? So I corresponded with all these people, and they were in France, Russia, Switzerland, Germany, Scandinavia, America, etc. And then I went to visit them. So I had various possibilities for travel. I got various grants and so on. I went to India and met some of the leading non-violence thinkers and activists in India, the Jains particularly, who impressed me greatly with their firmness of resolve. I met a wonderful, Jain elder who, we got on very well, and with the different Jain communities that organise meetings in Ladnan. I've stayed in touch with them ever since, and I've been back about 10 times to India. I went to Russia and I met some of the leading philosophers in Russia. We had a conference in Moscow at the university. Well, it was an independent conference attached to the Institute of Philosophy in Moscow, which is their greatest think tank. The Russian intellectuals I found were incredibly intelligent, unbelievably intelligent, and good people. I mean, they were coming from a Marxist or post-Marxist perspective, but they knew their stuff, and they were polyglots in many languages. I discovered the Institute of Oriental Studies in Moscow, where they were studying unbelievably amazing, Sufi and Buddhist and other things. Russia is an amazing intellectual superpower in its own right. And they were also asking, what is peace? How can we get peace? We don't want this Cold War. It was the time when Gorbachev was still in power, and he'd made this decision to unilaterally end the Cold War. He was an intellectual, Gorbachev. And I met people who were his advisors, so I didn't meet him personally, but he was a patron of our conference. And at that conference I was elected coordinator of Philosophers for Peace around the world, which was a huge, like an accolade. I was just a young academic starting out of my studies, and these old learned philosophers from all over the world gave me that mission, which I've carried on with and have tried to fulfill as much as possible, and still do. So Anyway, cut a long story short, I then set up an institute at the University of London because that was my job, research and feasibility into doing it. And then other people said, Paul Smoker and other experts in peace, don't just research the feasibility, Thomas, set it up. We'll support you. So I did, and that is still going. That's the Institute of Peace Studies and Global Philosophy, which is still going. It's run from here in France, but I'd love to stimulate the creation of an academic chair in peace research still at the University of London, but in other universities around the world. I've travelled to about 35 countries, interviewing people. I have on tape and recording interviews with probably the most important thinkers about peace in the last 50 years, many of whom became my friends, and some sadly are no longer with us, but their work lives on. So anyway, that's my and also as part of that I set up a multi-faith mediation service, because I also because of my interest in religion and spirituality and my recognition that it's a factor in conflict. I was unusual because quite a few academic experts in peace and conflict resolution, they come from a very scientific and if not secular perspective. And they're developing a scientific approach to peace and conflict. Some are mathematicians, some think that you can kind of quantify how to solve conflict, that peace is a kind of new science that can be developed like a mathematical thing, and that they love computers, so they program in all the wars and quarrels, and they look at the results and they say, this formula is what we need, etc. I take a slightly different track, which is because I'm interested in religious studies and philosophical paradigm clashes, I've gone in much more to the metaphysical side of conflict. Now that's unusual, and however, it's what I've been doing, and that became eventually my PhD thesis, right? So I based my PhD research on all this exploration, and I said, well, look, I was then elected also coordinator for UK and Ireland of a thing called the World Conference on Religion and Peace, which is the biggest interfaith peace group in the planet, based in New York, and it has 70 countries, have chapters and so on. And I was on the committee for Europe. I went to lots of interfaith conferences, including in Rome, at the Vatican, and with the former Pope, John Paul II, and some brilliant Catholic intellectuals, but also people like Hans Kuhn were there, and I talked to him, and many other great thinkers who are looking for peace. The Vatican has changed its tune since the old days of the Inquisition, thank God. And people like Hans Kuhn, but also Karl Rahner, the great theologian from Germany, and and others, and the later Pope Benedict, who I didn't meet, but he was a scholar from that tradition, really. In the Church's view, we should sublimate our conflicts to scholarship. And that's why the university grew out of Western Christian thinking. People like Abelard and other great thinkers, Duns Scotus, they wanted to think through the nature of God, like Thomas Aquinas and so on. Well, I can resonate with that tradition. When I went to the Vatican, it was like I'd died and gone to heaven. I got a library ticket to the Vatican Library. I mean, it's paradise there. I go there whenever I can, but... So I'm with them. I'm saying let's have scholarship instead of war and violence. But this led me, as I say, to very, very deep studies of comparative spirituality. And having set up this mediation service between different warring religious groups called the Multi-Faith and Multicultural Mediation Service, that was in '95. And since then, a whole load of cases are brought to our attention. They still are. So, if you're watching and you know of some... even at the micro level of like neighbours, like the police in Southampton once called me up and said, Thomas, we have a problem in Southampton. We've got Sikhs and Muslims attacking each other and putting dog poo down each other's letterboxes because of somebody's, insulted somebody. So that it could be like communal interfaith tension in a urban environment. It can be conflicts within different religions, so I don't know, different branches of Christians can sometimes be quite foul to each other. Just think of the Cathar Wars when the Catholics went to try and kill all the Gnostics. And I've mediated cases of Wiccans fighting each other over who's the real Wiccan. There's the old guard and the new guard. The old guard are the ones that say Wicca's a hereditary thing. You're born into a pagan family who've been witches for centuries and persecuted. And then the new ones are these people that have been initiated since Gardner and the Alexandrian traditions, and they're just like kind of new agey. They're not real Wiccans at all. So I mediated conflicts between these groups. And also I was approached by the Druids of Britain to mediate their conflict with English heritage and the government over management and access to Stonehenge. And that's where I got involved really with the Druid community, because I didn't know there were any Druids until my dear friend Douglas Lyne took me to the Druid Council of Britain and said, look, help this lot. And one of the problems was they were all fighting each other. All these Druid factions, again, were fighting, like who's the Archdruid, who's the best one. Council meetings were often very difficult because they would all shout and interrupt each other. And it was absolute, I felt sorry because, gosh, is that what the Druids have come to? Is that, it's like they're still in shock about the Roman conquest. Anyway, eventually I was elected peace officer of that council, and I remained that, because Druidry also speaks to me, because it was a peace religion. The Druids were the people that mediated the conflicts of the Celtic tribes. And, gosh, it's not easy, because the Celts were very fierce warriors. And they were known throughout the classical world as pretty tough people. They did happen to sack Delphi, and they sacked Rome. Give a Celt a chance and he'll come and sack your temple. So, which is why Caesar then counter-invaded and conquered Gaul. And it's tit for tat. I would have just sat down the Archdruid of Gaul and the Pontifex Maximus of Rome and said, look, let's make a peace deal. You can do your trading here. The Celts in Gaul have been trading with Italy and the Etruscans for centuries. The Hallstatt culture and the Latin culture were highly sophisticated. Even before Rome was even founded, the Hallstatt burials they found in the Champagne region of France, buried in their chariots with gold and jewellery and stuff. These are highly sophisticated people, these Celts. And since moving to France, I've been studying Druidry across Britain and Europe, and writing a book about it. So, but what we know about the Druids is they were the peacemakers of the Celts. So, that's why I think it's an important tradition to revive. What did they know? And how can we find out what they knew? That's what Merlin was trying to do, in the court of Arthur. So they were like the equivalent of the Jains of Europe, if you want. The Jains in India are non-violent, cutting edge, if you want. And the Druids in Europe were doing the same. So that's what has made me pursue these paths in great detail. So that's where I'm coming from, as a peace thinker, a peace activist, and a universal metaphysician working on the philosophy of peace. And as I said, I've met most of the leading intellectuals on the planet dealing with peace and the philosophy of justice and conflict resolution and so on. And there's lots more now. There's a whole new generation come up since I did this research, which was pioneering. And that's great. But we still don't have our chair at the University of London. We still don't have an Institute of Peace Studies in Bloomsbury, which is what I want. And we still don't have chairs of peace studies in all the universities in the Middle East, which is what I want. We have a few in Israel. We have a peace centre in Tehran, but there's not a lot going on in between. There's nothing in Saudi Arabia. I would like a peace institute in Medina to be funded by Saudi money, and I'd be happy to go and set it up and be professor of peace and Sufism and Islamic studies and Quranic studies, because I've been doing, amongst all this work, a detailed commentary on the Quran from a peace hermeneutic perspective, looking at the Quran as a document for peace, which is what it was. That was the whole point of Islam. The whole point of what Muhammad was trying to do was to channel this amazing Quran into the midst of this warring culture of Arabs to find peace. Islam means the finding of peace. Now, I know that some clever Christian missionaries say, no, it doesn't mean submission. But, it's the same thing. You can't have peace till you surrender. We need to surrender to the absolute, all of us, and how we approach that absolute, to surrender to that absolute, we can approach it in a variety of ways. The Jains approach it by saying the absolute is many-sided. No one can sum up what the absolute is. So we best be peaceful and loving to each other, because we're all part of that absolute. The Neoplatonists talk about the one, but beyond the one, there's the absolute, the good. And the Kabbalists and Jews talk about the tree of life, the Keter principle, but beyond the Keter there's the Ein Sof, which is the absolute, the unknowable. And in Islam there are the 99 names of Allah, God, and yet, the ultimate name is something you have to experientially dive into. You can only have that quality of love when you surrender. And that's the point of my commentary on the Quran, which is known as a tafsir. It's a work of commentary, right? So anyway, in amongst all this, then, and I was working in Scotland doing commentaries on the Quran, on the books of Enoch, and studying deeply all this peace stuff, working with the Druid community and the Christian community. I've also been very active in peace work in the Christian community. I was baptised as an Anglican, which seemed to me a sort of middle way between the extreme Protestants and extreme Catholics. I love Protestants and Catholics, so how can I be fair to both? Well, the Anglican Church, that's what its mission is to be Catholic and Protestant and Orthodox and Gnostic. And I met a lot of great Anglican theologians and intellectuals, bishops and so on, and professors. And then but I've also remained in touch with the Quakers. I still regard myself as a sort of Quaker. I love the Society of Friends. There's simple worship of silence. It's something I do as a daily practice. And but also, the Roman Catholic Church, I have many friends and colleagues and have worked with aspects of them. I sat on the board of the Anglican Pacifist Fellowship, which is the main peace organisation in the Church of England, and so I have many friends in the Anglican Church who are working for peace. And the word pacifist is often misunderstood. It's interpreted by some as a kind of complete renunciation of any violence, which technically, yes, but it also means to make peace. And it comes from two roots in Latin: pax, peace, and faceo, to make. So a pacifist is someone that is trying to make peace. So peacemaker is the best way. And that is what I want to talk about in relation to Brexit, because if we apply conflict analysis to the problems of Brexit, what I'm going to now move on to is my, as a peace thinker, as a peace activist, as a pacifist in the best sense of the word, a peacemaker, I want to then explain why Brexit is such a challenge, okay? So anyway, sorry about that long introduction. That's just so people really know where I'm coming from, because people might know some little bit of my work, and I've only just summarised it, of course. If you want to know the details, you have to read my autobiography or come and meet me, But read some of my 50 books that I've published, or the hours of lectures I've given that are on my Green University website, which I set up. Okay, so that's where I'm coming from and why it's so important for me. As you can see, this quest for peace has been a lifelong, determination of mine to do what I can. Right, so if we look at Brexit through the analysis of conflict analysis and peace research, what do we see? Why is it a problem? Okay, so let me explain that in the schools of conflict research that I've been associated with, I was the information officer for the Conflict Research Society for many years. I worked closely with Professor Cedric Smith, who was a professor at University College and was the patron and sponsor of my institute when it was set up. He was a mathematician and a geneticist and a great man